Hello and welcome to the Cybersecure Ed podcast. I'm your host, Claudiu Popa, and this is episode 2 of our 10-part series. The topic of the day today is about data breaches. Are our schools ready for data breaches? Are we as parents or educators ready for data breaches? We ask these questions, we discuss these with our special guest, Stephen Abouldahab from the ICTC. He is a tech-savvy educator. He's got all kinds of on-the-ground, from the trenches information for us. And we'll be launching a brand new survey. This will be a nationwide survey for educators, for parents. We want to know what kind of ed tech is being introduced in our schools. For the most part, this education technology is fantastic. It tries to enhance, it tries to bring new ways of thinking to kids. It tries to aggregate information so that trends can be gleaned and acted upon. And in many, many cases, unfortunately, we have seen that a lot of this technology is not exactly transparent. So, without further ado, I want to introduce Steve Abouldahab. Steve, how are you doing and what do you do on a daily basis? Tell us about your work.
Hi, Claudio. Thank you for inviting me to this podcast. I'm really excited to chat with you and your listeners today. So just to give you a little background, I've been involved in education in one way, shape, or form for the last 20 years or so. I started my teaching career teaching overseas. I taught English in Peru. And then when I returned, when I returned from Peru, I did a lot of sort of education-related jobs and didn't really know I wanted to be a teacher. So, I worked in camps and canoe instructor and things like that. And it wasn't until my early 30s that I decided I wanted to go to teachers college. So that's when I got my formal teaching education in Ontario and worked in an elementary school. And that was sort of in the early 2000s. So that's when a lot of these, social media tools and other ed tech tools were becoming more and more popular. And I found myself drawn towards them. So I sort of became the go-to person that other teachers would come to, oh, Steve, I have a problem, with my computer. What should I do? And I would say, did you try turning it off and on? Or did you check to see if it was plugged in? Those sorts of problem solving. And it just evolved. And then I taught in the secondary panel where, again, I'm an early adopter. So when I find a tool that I think is interesting, I try it out. And that's kind of what I want to sort of bring up in this conversation is, as a teacher that takes initiative and tries new things out, I wasn't really considering, the kind of exposure I was leaving for my students when trying out these new tools. And I wanted immediate tools, right? I wanted to use these things right away because I saw them as being really valuable for both my teaching practice and for students. And so it wasn't until I started working with ICTC where, I'm working with students across Canada to hopefully encourage them to pursue a career in STEM. The idea being that, moving forward, all jobs, all businesses will be technology related in some way. And so the more digitally literate students become, the more employable they'll be. And that'll hopefully translate into a strong Canadian economy. But included in that is also, online safety and managing your data and understanding the risks. So ICTC has really been involved with cybersecurity. We have a national competition called Cyber Titan. Shameless plug, we have our final competition in May, in October, where we've invited the top 10 teams from across Canada to compete. And we also do in-class activities for students both virtually and physically. And so I invite any teachers listening, if you have an interest in having your students exposed to a fun cybersecurity challenge, to look on our website, digitalyouth.ca, and contact us, because we're available across Canada to do an activity with their students. So I'm kind of rambling on here, but I think the bottom line is I've learned now what's really at stake, and how much risk we put our students who are minors and don't have the ability for consent when we use these tools.
You know what? You're not rambling on at all. However, I don't think any of us know exactly how much risk there is. And I'm not saying that from a fear-based perspective. I'm saying it because some of the activities that are taking place will be impacting kids, students over the coming generation, right? So we're talking about a generation ahead with the data collection that is taking place, with what can be aggregated. The fact is, what we're doing with, I'm hearing meows.
Yes, I apologize.
What we're doing with schools, what my nonprofit foundation, KnowledgeFlow, is doing with schools is literally simply communicating the fact that, hey, you know what, you're introducing a brand new innovative technology, but at the same time, you are aggregating information, and you are creating a new storage medium or a new storage place to contain this information, right? So up until now, school boards and schools have sheltered personal information within the warm and fuzzy confines of their server rooms. Now it's being put in the cloud with unknown security layers. And so that the ability of individuals to gauge how much trust to place in these tools and in these platforms rests on the due diligence that is being done by school boards, by schools, and of course, at the front lines are the educators themselves. So I'm so glad that you're not just a tech savvy educator, but you're also a communicator. That makes a huge difference. Do you find that beyond your own context, do you find that you're able to push that message of awareness to other educators? Now, I know that's why you're here today, and this is fantastic. We really appreciate having you on. Do you have any other ways of getting out to people?
Well, I think what's really important too is, we deal directly with the students. We work with both the teachers and the students, but the more aware the students are, the better prepared they'll be to protect themselves. So that's a really high priority for us. And then with regards to teachers, we do have these conversations. I find though that it's generally the teachers who are, like myself, who are early adopters, who really take the time to look into things, that are generally more knowledgeable about it. Those that use a lot of these tools, on a regular basis, either rely on the school board or just don't really have a full understanding of what's being taken. And I'm going to ask you a question because, I was having this conversation with my wife yesterday, who's an elementary school teacher. And, I was sort of trying to explain to her what this podcast was about and why it's important to protect this data. And her question was, why is data valuable? And I think this comes to the root of part of the problem we're having as a society in general, when we're accepting those terms and conditions, is that we just don't see our data as necessarily being as valuable as it is. And it's difficult to assign a risk level. So people will often say, well, what's the big deal if someone has my name or my phone number, or even is just tracking me in the background? What's the big deal if they're tracking me in the background? And it's a valid question. It's hard to articulate what the real issue is with tracking. Can you help to clarify that?
Absolutely. I think one of the things that are missing in not just public education, but the media coverage that we're seeing on a daily basis is the fact that you see the word hacked or data breach or security failures or vulnerabilities, etc. But really, the impact is not illustrated. And I think that does a disservice to the population and to society in general. Anytime you see a data breach, you need to realize that information has been exposed. That information is usually personal information. Those are personal identities, right? So people always talk about a data breach has occurred and 200 million records have been exposed. That means nothing to anybody, right? Who cares? What are records? Are we talking about LPs, 45s, 33s? What the media needs to do is to get used to saying digital identities or personal identities. So my preference would be to tell people, hey, you know what? Your personal identity that was in the custody of this company has now been exposed. What that means is there is a risk of identity fraud that will occur between now and until you change your identity elements, your identity details. So I always tell people between let's say a social insurance number and a credit card number, which one would you rather lose? Obviously, it's the one identity element that you can change because you can simply make a phone call, get a new credit card, but you can't change your social insurance number. And so when a company loses that information, you're exposed for as long as you have that same social insurance number. What are you exposed to? You're exposed to having a virtual clone of yourself walk into a bank and open a bank account. You're exposed to someone impersonating you, let's say at your kid's school or as they're calling a radio station or whatever it might be that would see a stranger benefit from services that would be allocated to you. Does that kind of start to help illustrate the impact?
It does. Explain to me or help me understand why it's innate to feel insecure if I leave my car unlocked and there's $500 on the car seat, or not even just leaving my car unlocked, or leaving my front door unlocked, or leaving something valuable, even in a locker somewhere, or something like that. Why do we automatically know that this is risky versus this digital realm where there is an absolute possibility that I could lose a lot more than $500 if someone engaged in credit card fraud with my name. But I think for many people it just doesn't seem likely. And then when we start to discuss children and minors, people don't see how the minors are really going to be affected. I think this is part of the conversation that we need to have to bring it into clear terms where those real risks lie, and making it understandable.
So that's a great way to articulate the question. We know that people are naturally visual and tactile creatures, right? As humans, we see the risk because we can see that the door is open, so we can imagine ourselves going through it. We can't see our data. This is all an intangible asset that we have. We have an awful lot of it, and we have no idea just how much of it there is behind the scenes. Facebook, all of the social media platforms are storing statistics, metadata, you name it, identified, de-identified about us. We're constantly creating information. And all that information is so hard to grasp for our human brains. It's only been 10,000 years that we've made significant progress as a civilization from a cultural perspective. It's all been tactile, visual, and tangible, right? So suddenly, in the past 20 years, here we are dealing with most of what we are, most of what we own, most of what makes companies valuable is intangible. You can't put your finger on it. And in fact, the money is also intangible. It's just a bunch of zeros and ones in a bank account. They're no longer sitting on stacks of money and cackling sadistically like the cartoon characters. And so this is key. And I'm glad you asked that question. This is why educators are in such a privileged position today, because they are people who are able to grasp what I just said, especially tech savvy ones like yourself. But who are they talking to? Their audience is more than likely digital natives. These are kids, these are young people who don't know anything other than living online and having their digital identities intermixed with their personal identities. For them, their digital intangible identities are just as real as real life. Therefore, when I talk to them, when I go into schools, when I go into community centers and I talk to kids, they have a visual image of what their information is about. And that's something that we as educators need to latch onto and continue giving them visual feedback so that they can strengthen those images and see the information that is leaking out of them or that is being taken away, siphoned out of them or their family. They can see it as a tangible, real thing that they can simply put up their hand and say, hey, did you ask me for consent before you collected that piece of me? How about that?
Yeah, that's really well put, and I think that leads to who's doing the interview here, because it leads to another question that I have, and that is that teachers, we're all really busy, and terms and conditions are very long and legalese and difficult to decipher, and so what is meaningful consent? When I scroll through something and click, yeah, I agree, is that meaningful consent? Have I really consented to all of the things that are in that agreement? And so, as a teacher, when I'm going through and I'm using these tools with students, I've got to be honest, I'm not reading, just like in my personal life, I'm not really reading thoroughly through the terms and conditions that I'm agreeing to and that I'm exposing my students to. And so it leads me to wonder, is the solution legislation? So should the government mandate that, we have a privacy policy in place for children so that any technology company that operates in Canada has to have some basic, rules and regulations with regard to that? I know we have PIPEDA for the entire population, but should there be a separate code for children or minors? And then, how do we change teacher behaviors? Because the problem of these terms and conditions being lengthy and difficult to decipher, I don't think that's going to change. And so how do we get teachers like myself, who's eager to use one of these technology tools to enhance the education that I can, help my students with? How do I change those behaviors?
Excellent question. I really appreciate the fact that you've touched upon the legislation, which is increasingly old. It's certainly starting to show its age, and as with most privacy legislation in Canada, its enforceability is really lacking. So one thing that so if it says one thing, being able to enforce the right thing to do for organizations is quite another. And so that will be a recurring topic in our series. For example, next week we talk about how does legislation influence technology adoption in public education. In a couple of weeks, episode 6, can the law adequately protect children and students? So we're going to have privacy lawyers on to talk to about this kind of thing. And all of it is relevant. So I'm glad that you're asking these questions, because as an educator, you can see these questions that need to be asked, and no doubt other educators are seeing them as well. But to get back to your original question around consent, I tend to prefer the original terminology of informed consent, right, rather than meaningful consent, because meaningful is a more abstract term. And as I said, we want to get to be a little bit more concrete. Meaningful is certainly great. It's baked into the law. But informed to me means you can get me to consent to anything, but if I don't understand it, then it doesn't matter. Obviously, it's meaningless, but it's the informed word that means the onus is on you to present it in such a way that people are informed. The idea is not to deceive individuals into either saying yes or not saying anything and considering it an opt-out type of consent. The idea here is that we need to have enough respect for audiences to ask for consent, and that brings us directly into the survey. We have this amazing new survey that our foundation worked with an industrial psychologist to make sure that these questions are both relevant and adequately articulated. And we simply came up with 10 questions for educators and for parents that establish what your classroom's EdTech adoption score is. We gave it an initialism, EAS, just to sound really trendy. But the idea here is just anonymously, you go online to survey.edtechprivacy.ca, and we're going to make this very public, and it's going to be re-released week after week, because we want to see additional information as it comes in from teachers and from parents. But to give you an idea, and I think you saw, I gave you a glimpse at this survey tool, and you probably get the sense that what we're after is to understand the degree to which parents and teachers ask questions about the technology that is increasingly populating their kids' classrooms. So one of the things that we talked about last week with our illustrious enabler, who's working behind the scenes to make this show work, Stephen Hurley, we talked about passwords, and we talked about the fact that in so many classrooms, kids are given passwords by the school board. That means there are multiple levels of individuals who have access and maintain custody over the kid's password. Therefore, by the time the password gets to the kid, they are no longer uniquely identifiable using that password. If you have a password that doesn't uniquely identify you, then what good is it? And furthermore, if this is happening in a school system, what are we teaching kids about protecting their digital identities? So this is something that we are hoping will make teachers think, and of course it will catalyze some questions from parents, because we are seeing an unfortunate lack of pushback on the part of parents who are absolutely not apathetic about this. They care a lot about who's collecting their kids' information, but they have no idea that it's happening for the most part. That's where the informed consent comes in, but also they don't know what questions to ask and who to go to. So having had an opportunity to take a look at some of these questions, Steve, I wonder if any of them caught your eye. What do you think?
Well, I think there were some really great questions. They certainly get to the root of how we use technology in the classroom and the sorts of things that we're thinking about or maybe not thinking about. There were a few of the questions where honestly I would have had to answer, I don't know, I haven't read that, or I'm not sure. And so that brings me to sort of another thought with regards to the responsibility. I think that one thing we're seeing more and more in private organizations is this chief information security officer, the CISO or the CSO, and school boards don't really have a role like that. And so from a teacher's perspective, if I need some help and support in trying to understand, what tools are out there and what risks there are, we don't really have someone to go to. So I think there's a lot of work that needs to be done at the different levels in order to make sure that our students' privacy is protected and that their data is protected and all of that. But yeah, there were definitely some interesting questions that you had on there, and I think it'll reveal a lot with regards to what's happening in the classroom and at home.
And it takes 2 minutes to complete. As I said, we're protecting the identities of respondents. The idea is to get a score from 1 to 10 so that you have a clear picture or a clearer picture of the maturity or the risk level involved with the ed tech that that is being made available in your classroom. So a very quick survey. I hope all of our listeners pass it on. It's survey.edtechprivacy.ca. And to your point around the need for a well-trained, qualified CISO, the need for a CISO is actually supplemented by the need for a qualified and, if necessary, certified CPO, a chief privacy officer. These are useful, educated individuals who have definitely a role to play in school boards. In many cases, we've seen this in organizations, and I see this on a daily basis in my information security work. Chief privacy officers are simply the third or fourth job that someone has to do. It's just an unsuspecting individual in an organization is given this extra hat to wear, but they're by no means are they trained. And for the most part, chief privacy officers are not professionally certified. So there's a need for that kind of professional certification, because maintaining those certifications on an annual basis means continuous learning. One of the, and we're coming to a close in the next couple of minutes here, but one of the priorities that I have, especially for this limited series of cyber ed podcasts, is to make it clear that responsible security and privacy in education does not have to be rocket science. I'm not a rocket scientist. You are probably closer to being a rocket scientist than I am. The idea here is that school boards need to focus on one thing: due diligence, right? So we all see cool, innovative, shiny, sparkly things. Do your due diligence before you introduce EdTech in any setting. Make sure that you do your research so you understand where the data is, or the data are, because I prefer to use the plural of the word, going, right? Who are the data shared with? And at the school level, principals need to ask more questions. Of course, teachers are the front lines, and if they see that perhaps some of the questions in our survey have triggered their awareness, such as, hey, should I be handing out a password that cannot be changed to students? Have I read the privacy policy for this tool that I think is pretty cool, but I'm now encouraging kids to punch in their names and their usernames and their passwords into? Have I reminded kids to use different passwords for different websites? Things of that nature are not rocket science. They're extremely basic best practices. And of course, it contributes to making kids unhackable for an entire generation to come. Right. So, of course, for me, self-serving, hashtag unhackable, we have this program where we talk to kids about being unhackable, both from a hacking perspective, but also from privacy and online responsibility perspective. So I really do appreciate your coming on today, Steve. Do you have any parting thoughts for us?
Well, two things. One novel thing I was thinking is we should create an AI terms and conditions bot that it's a plugin on Chrome, and it just takes all of the mumbo jumbo and puts it into plain language. The other thing is to remind the listeners that, when we get these quote unquote free tools to use with our students, they're not really free, right? They come at a cost, and I think that's what we have difficulty understanding. And so, school boards, teachers are enticed by these free tools. But thank you so much for inviting me to have this conversation, Claudio. I hope to continue it with you, and I hope that I was able to share something meaningful for your audience.
You certainly have, and thank you for that note on the cognitive dissonance between tools that are free or even tools that are suspiciously cheap, and the ability to understand the fact that an ed tech or any other kind of tool might be predatory. We're thinking of introducing the hashtag bad tech, but I'm still working on that. So really, thank you very much. I want to remind our listeners once again, survey.edtech KnowledgePrivacy.ca. Thank you to Steve Abouldahab, our special guest today, and thanks again to Stephen Hurley, our enabler in the back end, who's pulling the levers and pressing buttons to make sure this show is as slick as possible. Thank you very much. We'll talk to you next week on Cybersecurity.